Her husband sold her to pay his debts. The cowboy bought her freedom and offered his name. The first bid came before Lydia Owen could catch her breath. $50. The voice rose out of the crowd like it had done this 100 times before. Maybe it had. Maybe that was the worst part. The men standing in the Sheridan Town Square did not look shocked. They looked curious. Some looked amused. A few looked away, pretending not to see. But none of them stopped it. Lydia stood beside the wooden post with her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the rough timber just to stay upright. 3 days earlier she had still been a wife. Not a happy one, not for a long while, but still a woman with a home, a name, and at least the thin cover of respectability. Then Thomas Owens vanished after losing more money than he could ever repay. He left no apology, no goodbye, just a signed paper saying his land, his wagon, and his wife could be taken to settle what he owed. Now she stood on a raised platform in the middle of town while men measured her future with numbers. 60. 75. The dust blew across the square with the April wind, stinging her eyes until she could not tell what came from grit and what came from tears. She kept her chin up because if she let it fall, she feared she might never lift it again. Frank Chambers, the auctioneer, slapped the paper in his hand and shouted louder. Mrs. Lydia Owens, healthy, young, house-trained, sold to settle a lawful debt. Lydia shut her eyes. The shame was almost too much to bear. This was America. This was Wyoming territory. Yet she was being sold like a horse because the man who promised to love her found it easier to trade her than face the wreck he had made. Then she heard the voice she would remember for the rest of her life. 100. Her eyes opened at once. The voice had come from near the back of the crowd. Calm, firm, not drunk, not excited, not cruel. A man stood there with one hand resting on a hitching post, his hat pulled low against the sun. He looked like any trail-worn cowboy passing through town, dust on his boots, faded blue shirt, brown vest, gun belt hanging easy at his hips. But there was something about the way he stood that did not match the others. He looked angry, not at her, at all of it. 125, snapped Wilbur Simmons from the front row. Lydia knew him on sight. Everyone in Sheridan did. He owned the brothel on the edge of town and smiled too easily whenever a woman was cornered. The stranger did not even glance his way. 300. A murmur ran through the crowd. Simmons's face darkened. 350. The cowboy pushed off the post and stepped forward just enough that Lydia could see his face under the brim of his hat. He was young, maybe 30, strong jaw, blue eyes sharp as winter sky, clean-shaven except for a little trail dust and shadow. Not handsome in the polished way city men tried to be. Handsome in the dangerous way honest men sometimes were without meaning too. 500, he said. Silence fell over the square. Even the wind seemed to pause. Frank Chambers blinked twice like he had not expected the number himself. Then he brought the gavel down fast. Sold. Lydia did not move. She could not. The crowd parted as the stranger walked toward the platform. The jingle of his spurs matched the pounding of her heart. She had told herself not to hope. Hope had done enough damage in her life already. Hope was what led her west with Thomas after he promised her a bigger future. Hope was what kept her silent the first time he lied, then the second, then the 10th. But this man's face held no hunger, no smug pleasure, no ownership, only purpose. He stopped in front of the platform and removed his hat. Mrs. Owens, he said gently, my name is Heath Vance. I'd like to speak with you, but not here. Would you allow me to escort you to the hotel dining room? The words were so respectful that for one strange second Lydia nearly cried again. She looked at the men still watching, at Simmons's sour face, at Frank Chambers pretending sudden interest in his ledger, then back at the cowboy who had just paid a fortune for a stranger. I have nowhere else to go, she whispered. Heath nodded once. Without touching her, he turned to the auctioneer. The paperwork. Frank hurried to hand it over, all false smiles now that money had changed hands. Heath signed something quickly, jaw tight, then folded the paper and tucked it into his vest. This way, he said. The walk across town felt longer than any road Lydia had ever traveled. Eyes followed them from the boardwalks and shop windows. She heard whispers, Laughter from somewhere behind her. Once she thought she heard her own name spoken in pity. That one hurt worst of all. Inside the hotel dining room, quiet replaced the noise outside. A few tables sat empty. A clock ticked on the wall. The air smelled of coffee and fresh bread. Heath pulled out a chair for her and waited until she sat before taking the chair across from her. Only then did he remove the folded paper from his vest. A waitress came by and asked if they wanted tea. Heath looked to Lydia instead of answering for her. She nodded. When they were alone again, Lydia found enough strength to speak. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice thin but steady, "you paid a great deal of money for me. I would like to know what you expect in return." What? Heath's expression changed at once. Not anger at her, anger at the question itself. "I expect nothing," he said firmly. Lydia stared at him. He unfolded the paper and laid it flat on the table between them. She saw Thomas's name at the bottom, saw the cruel neat words that had turned her from wife to debt. Then Heath tore it in half. The sound was small, paper, nothing more, but to Lydia it sounded like thunder. He tore the halves again, then again, again. He kept going until the bill of sale was nothing but a scattering of paper scraps between the tea cups. "You're free, Mrs. Owens," he said. Lydia forgot how to breathe. She looked down at the torn paper, then up at him, then down again as if freedom might disappear if she did not keep her eyes on it. "I don't understand," she whispered. "What happened out there was wrong," Heath said. "No person should be bought or sold, not ever." The simplicity of it broke something open in her. For the first time that day, the tears that filled her eyes did not come from shame. They came from relief so sudden it made her hands tremble worse than before. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked. He leaned back slightly, not in distance but in care, as if giving her room to hold herself together. "Because $500 is a fair price for doing what's right," he said quietly. "And because if a man sees something evil and walks away from it, then he has joined it." Lydia searched his face for mockery, for hidden terms, for the trap she had missed. She found none, only honesty. It unsettled her more than cruelty almost could have, because cruelty she knew how to survive. Kindness had become unfamiliar. Heath spoke again, more carefully now. "Do you have family?" Lydia shook her head. "No one living." "Friends?" "No one who could help." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I own a ranch near the Montana border, North Star Ranch. My housekeeper left in February to care for her sister back east. I could offer you work there if you want it. Honest work. Fair pay, your own cabin, no demands beyond the job." Lydia stared. "You're offering me employment." "And safety," he said, "only if you want it." She wrapped both hands around her untouched teacup. Heat pressed into her palms. Her whole life had collapsed in less than a week. Boston had been years ago now, but she suddenly remembered her mother once telling her that sometimes God sends rescue in plain clothes so frightened people won't be too scared to reach for it. Heath Vance looked nothing like an angel. He looked tired and dusty and real, which made him easier to trust. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Cooking, cleaning, keeping the big house from turning into a barn when I'm too busy to notice it has." The corner of his mouth lifted just a little. It was the first sign of softness she had seen in him. Lydia almost smiled back. "Do you often spend $500 to hire housekeepers?" she asked. "No," he said. "This is a first." That made her smile for real, though it trembled at the edges. Outside the window she could still see people crossing the street, still living their lives as if nothing terrible had happened in the square that morning. But something terrible had happened, and something remarkable had happened after it. She could leave Sheridan with this man and step into an unknown future, or she could stay and face a town that had watched her be sold. There was no real choice at all. "I accept," she said softly. Heath exhaled like he had been holding his breath. "Then we leave in the morning." The waitress returned with fresh tea and a plate of bread neither of them had asked for. Perhaps she had seen enough to understand this was no ordinary meeting. Lydia took one bite and realized she was starving. Heath pretended not to notice how quickly she ate. Instead he asked if she needed supplies for the journey, a new dress, a riding skirt, boots, soap, hairpins. He said it all in the plain tone of a man making a list, but she felt the care in it anyway. "No one has asked me what I need in a long time," she said before she could stop herself. He looked at her steadily. "Then start getting used to it." The words were simple. Still, they landed deep. Later that afternoon, he walked her to the mercantile and waited outside the dressing room while she tried on practical clothes for travel. He paid without making a show of it. Then he carried her small parcel and saw her back to the hotel, where he had rented her a room for the night and one for himself down the hall. At her door, he handed her the parcel and stepped back. "I'll be downstairs at sunrise," he said. "If you change your mind, you can say so then." Lydia frowned faintly. "You think I might run?" "No," Heath said. "I think you've had enough men deciding your future for one lifetime. I want you to know tomorrow is still your choice." She stood there looking at him, the hallway quiet around them, the afternoon light turning gold through the window at the end of the corridor. "What if I come?" she asked. His answer came without hesitation. "Then I'll get you safely to the North Star." He tipped his hat and turned away before she could think of anything more to say. Lydia went into her room and shut the door behind her. For a long time she just stood there. On the bed lay the new riding skirt. Beside it, a comb and a fresh bar of soap. On the washstand sat a pitcher of clean water. Ordinary things, small things. Yet after what had happened in the square, they felt like proof that the world had not gone fully cruel. At last she crossed to the bed and sat down. That morning she had been property. Now she was free. And somewhere beyond Sheridan was a ranch called North Star, and a cowboy with honest eyes who had offered her not pity, not ownership, but a chance to begin again. Lydia did not know yet that the road ahead would test both of them. She only knew that when she lay down that night, the first fragile feeling to rise above the shame was not fear. It was hope. Lydia woke before sunrise, though she had barely slept. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the auction block again, the rough wood beneath her hands, the faces in the crowd. Wilbur Simmons smiling like he had already decided what her life would become. Then she saw Heath Vance tearing the bill of sale into pieces, and the shame of the day before gave way to something she did not yet know how to carry. Hope could feel almost as frightening as fear when a person had gone too long without it. She dressed slowly in the new riding clothes Heath had bought for her. The dark skirt fit well enough to travel in, and the sturdy boots felt strange after years of making do with shoes too worn and too thin. She brushed out her hair, pinned it back neatly, and packed the few things she had left into her carpet bag. When she stepped into the hotel lobby, Heath was already there. He stood near the front doors with his hat in one hand and her future waiting outside in the form of two saddled horses. The sight of him steadied her more than she wanted to admit. He looked like he belonged to the road, dust-colored duster, faded shirt, gun belt riding low. A man built more for open sky than hotel walls. When he saw her, he gave a polite nod. "Did you sleep at all?" "Well enough," Lydia said. He looked at her face and knew that was not true, but he was kind enough not to say so. Instead, he took her carpet bag from her hand and carried it outside. The morning air was cool, touched with spring and distant pine. The town was only just waking. A few wagons rolled over the street. Smoke curled from chimneys. Somewhere a dog barked. Sheridan looked ordinary again, and Lydia hated it for that. Ordinary places should not allow terrible things. Heath stopped beside a chestnut mare and rested his hand on her neck. "This is Penny," he said. "She's steady, good for long miles." Lydia reached out and stroked the mare's warm coat. "She's beautiful." Heath glanced at her. "Do you ride?" "I used to." He gave the faintest smile. "That's better than never." He helped her mount without lingering touch, only enough to settle her stirrup and make sure she was secure. Then he swung up onto his black stallion with easy grace, and together they rode north out of Sheridan. Lydia did not look back. She told herself it was strength. The truth was simpler. She could not bear to give that town one more glance. They rode for hours beneath a sky wide and blue enough to make a person feel very small or very free, depending on what lived inside them. At first they said little. Heath seemed to understand that silence was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was mercy. The land opened as they traveled. Rolling hills gave way to broad grass, scattered cottonwoods and creeks swollen with snowmelt. Wildflowers had begun to rise in patches of yellow and purple. The air smelled clean. Lydia had forgotten that the world could look this open. At midday, Heath guided the horses down toward a stream edged with willow brush. "We'll stop here." Lydia dismounted a little stiffly. The saddle felt natural and strange at once, like meeting an old version of herself she had not seen in years. Heath spread out a simple lunch of bread, jerky, and cheese from his saddlebags, then handed her a canteen. She drank and looked at him over the rim. "How did you come to be in Sheridan?" He tore a piece of bread in half before answering. "My horse threw a shoe outside town. I went looking for the blacksmith." Lydia stared at the moving creek. "So if your horse had stayed sound, you never would have seen the auction?" "No." The word was quiet. She tightened her grip on the canteen. "Then maybe Providence does ride with bad luck now and then." Heath considered that. "Maybe." There was a pause, then he asked, "How did you come west?" Lydia had known that question would come. She had almost feared it because once she began telling the truth, she would have to hear it all in her own voice. "Boston," she said at last. "That is where I was born." Heath looked surprised. "You don't hear many Boston voices this far west." She almost smiled. "Mine has worn down with disappointment." He did not laugh. That made it easier to go on. She told him about her parents dying within 2 winters of each other, about the small life left to her after that, about Thomas Owens arriving with polished boots, easy charm, and stories about land in Wyoming that would make them rich. She told him how handsome he had seemed then, how certain, how alive. She told him about the long train ride west, the wedding, the early weeks when she believed his promises. Then she told him about the rest, the gambling, the debts, the nights he never came home, the lies that multiplied like weeds, the way his temper sharpened whenever she asked questions, and at last the note he left behind when the debt had grown larger than his courage. Heath's jaw hardened as she spoke. When she finished, he looked down at the stream for so long that she wondered if she had said too much. Then he said, "A man who loves a woman doesn't throw her to wolves." The anger in his voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Lydia pressed her hands together in her lap. "No, he does." They rode again until evening found them at a small way station tucked beside the road. The keeper, a gray-haired man named Granger, gave them 2 rooms and hot supper. Lydia was grateful for the plain kindness of not being asked questions. After the meal, she sat by the common room fire with a cup of coffee warming her hands. Heath took the chair across from her and stretched out his legs with a sigh that told her even strong men felt long days in the saddle. "You travel often?" she asked. "Used to more." "What did you do before the ranch?" He looked into the fire. "A little of everything. Drove cattle, rode express for a while, worked as a deputy marshal, broke horses, dug post holes, whatever kept me moving." "Deputy marshal," Lydia repeated with a hint of surprise. His mouth twitched. "I had the badge, never had the patience." She smiled for real this time. He saw it and seemed pleased in a quiet way that did not embarrass her. "What made you settle on ranching?" At that his face changed. Softer now, more open. "My father never stayed in one place," he said. "We moved from camp to camp all through my childhood, different jobs, different towns, different women sometimes. My mother got tired of it before I was 10. He said the last part plainly, but Lydia heard the old hurt beneath it. "I suppose I promised myself I'd someday build something solid enough nobody I cared for could be blown out of it." She looked at him for a long moment. "The North Star is that promise." He nodded once. It struck Lydia then that this man did not rescue people because he enjoyed feeling noble. He did it because he knew exactly what it meant when the world beneath a person gave way. That night she slept more deeply than the first, and when she woke the next morning, she did not feel like a woman being taken somewhere by a stranger. She felt like a woman traveling towards something not yet ruined. The second day passed easier than the first. Her body remembered riding faster than she expected. Heath kept their pace comfortable, never making her feel slow. They stopped when she needed to stretch, and once when he noticed her rubbing one shoulder and wordlessly handed her a folded blanket to soften the saddle. By afternoon, the land began to change. More pines, longer shadows, low rises that opened into green valleys. Snow still touched the far mountains in white streaks. "This country is beautiful," Lydia said. Heath turned in the saddle. "Wait till you see the ranch." There was pride in his voice now, not boastful, earned. On the third day they crested a long hill and Heath pointed ahead. "We're on my land." Lydia looked out and forgot to breathe. The valley opened wide beneath them. A large log house sat near the center, its porch catching the late sun. A bunkhouse, stables, corrals, and several outbuildings stood nearby. Cattle moved like dark water over the distant grass. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. Cottonwoods lined a creek that curved through the lower field. The mountains watched from the west like old guardians. "Welcome to North Star," Heath said. The words sounded less like an introduction and more like a promise kept. As they rode down toward the house, people began to emerge. A broad-shouldered man with sandy hair came from the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers. Beside him, a round-faced woman in an apron stepped onto the porch. Two ranch hands paused near the corral fence and tipped their hats when they saw Heath. "This is Charlie Wilson, my foreman," Heath said as they dismounted. "And that's Martha Wilson. She keeps the place running and the men from starving." Martha Wilson laughed. "You tell that lie every time." But when she looked at Lydia, warmth filled her face at once. "Well now," Martha said, coming down the steps, "you must be Lydia. Heath said he might be bringing help, but he left out how pretty and tired you'd look by the time he got home. Come inside, child." The word child nearly undid Lydia on the spot. It had been so long since anyone spoke to her with motherly kindness that she almost did not know how to answer it. Charlie shook Heath's hand, then gave Lydia a polite nod. "Ma'am." "This is Miss Owen," Heath said. Lydia noticed the way he said it, not as something he had acquired, not as a burden explained, just her name, her own. Martha led her toward a small cabin set a little apart from the main house. "Heath had this fixed up for you before he even knew if you'd come," she said over one shoulder. Lydia looked at Heath. He did not seem embarrassed to be caught, only a little uncertain. The cabin was simple but lovely. A small stove, a bed neatly made with a patchwork quilt, a table under the window, fresh curtains, a vase with wildflowers on the shelf. Lydia set her carpet bag down slowly. No one had prepared a place for her in years. She turned back toward the door where Heath still stood. "You did this." His hand rested on the frame. "I thought if you came, you ought to have something that was yours." The room seemed to grow very still around them. Lydia had spent so long feeling disposable that she no longer knew what to do when someone treated her like she mattered. "Thank you," she said. Heath inclined his head. "Supper's at 6. Rest first." He stepped away then, leaving her in the small cabin filled with evening light and impossible gentleness. Lydia moved to the window and looked out at the valley, the barns, the main house, the man walking away with calm purpose in every step. 3 days earlier she had been sold like property. Now she stood in a place called North Star with a key to her own door, honest work ahead of her, and a cowboy whose goodness felt more dangerous than any cruelty she had ever known. Because for the first time in longer than she could bear to count, Lydia Owen was beginning to believe she might still have a life worth living. Life at North Star began quietly, and that was what healed Lydia first. No one stared at her. No one whispered when she entered a room. No one looked at her as if she belonged to some shameful story they wanted to repeat over supper. At Heath Vance's ranch, she was simply Lydia. That alone felt strange enough to make her chest ache. Mornings began before sunrise. She helped Martha Wilson in the kitchen, baked biscuits, packed lunches for the hands, and learned where everything belonged in the big ranch house. Afternoons brought washing, mending, and the sort of steady work that gave a person room to think without drowning in thought. Evenings were the best part. Supper with Heath. Sometimes Charlie and Martha joined them. Sometimes it was only the two of them at the long table while lamplight warmed the room and the day slowly softened into night. It did not happen all at once. That was why it felt so real. Heath never pushed, never hovered, never treated kindness like something she owed him back. He asked if she was settling in. He made sure her stove had enough wood. Once, after a long morning, he left a new pair of gloves on her porch rail because he had noticed the old ones rubbing blisters into her palms. He never mentioned it. She knew they were from him anyway. And little by little, Lydia began to breathe differently at North Star. Less like a hunted thing, more like a woman waking from a long, bad dream. One evening, after supper, she stood at the sink rinsing plates while Heath dried them with a towel. The window above the sink was open a crack, and cool spring air drifted in carrying the smell of damp earth and cattle grass. "You've changed the whole house," Heath said. Lydia glanced at him. "I only moved some things." "You did more than that." He nodded toward the window, where fresh curtains stirred softly in the breeze. Then toward the table where wildflowers sat in a simple jar. It used to feel like a place where a man slept and left again. "And now," he looked at her in a way that made her heart trip, "now it feels like home." She turned back to the dishes too quickly, afraid he might see too much on her face. By June, the ranch felt natural to her. She knew the sound of each step on the porch boards, the pattern of the cattle bells in the lower field, the way Heath's horse announced him before he even came into view. She also knew the shape of his goodness now. It lived in small things. The way he stopped to help a hand fix a broken stirrup instead of shouting for someone else to do it. The way he checked on Charlie's sick boy with medicine and books from town. The way he listened when anyone spoke to him as if their words had weight. She had never known a man like that, and that was the trouble. Because once a woman had seen what real kindness looked like, she could not pretend it meant nothing. The storm came in hard one night near the end of June. Spring storms on the frontier did not always announce themselves politely. One hour the sky was clear, and the next it was black with thunder. Lightning split the valley. Rain slammed the roof in sheets so heavy the gutters overflowed at once. The hands ran for the barns. Charlie shouted over the wind, trying to get the horses under cover. Martha barred the kitchen door against the gusts. Lydia had just finished securing the shutters when Heath came in already pulling on his slicker. "The north pasture," he said. "The new calves are still out there." Lydia felt fear rise sharp and fast. In this. He met her eyes. If that creek floods, they could be washed halfway to Canada. She knew better than to argue with a man who understood the land better than anyone. Still, the words came out before she could stop them. "Please be careful." He paused with one hand on the door. Then very quietly he said, "Will you wait up?" Her throat tightened. "Yes." He nodded once and stepped out into the storm. Hours passed. Rain battered the house. Thunder rolled so close the windows trembled in their frames. Lydia tried to sit still in the kitchen, but stillness was impossible. She folded cloths that did not need folding, refilled the kettle twice, went to the door every time the wind changed, listening for hoofbeats. When the door finally burst open, it was nearly midnight. Heath staggered inside with another man half hanging from his shoulder. The stranger was young. One of the ranch hands from the neighboring spread, and blood ran down the side of his face while his left leg bent wrong beneath him. "Martha," Heath barked. "Need you now." Everything moved fast after that. Martha cleared the big table. Lydia fetched hot water, clean cloths, whiskey, whatever was asked for. Heath laid the injured cowboy down while rain dripped from his coat onto the floor. The young man groaned once when Martha examined the leg and then bit hard on a strap Heath shoved between his teeth. "Broken clean," Martha said. "And that head cut looks worse than it is." Lydia held the lantern close while Martha cleaned the blood. Then she braced the man's shoulders when it came time to set the leg. The scream he let out shook her straight to the spine, but she did not let go. Heath looked at her once across the table, not in surprise, in gratitude. By dawn the danger had passed. The young cowboy slept under quilts in the side room, the leg set and the bleeding stopped. Martha had finally gone to lie down. The rain had eased to a soft, steady fall. Lydia sat in a chair near the kitchen stove, too tired to move. When she opened her eyes again, Heath was sitting across from her with a cup of coffee in his hands. Dawn light had begun to soften the windows. He looked worn to the bone, but his gaze was warm. "You were extraordinary last night," he said. She blinked away sleep. "I only helped." He shook his head. "You did more than that. You never lost your calm, not once." She looked down at her hands. Panic never fixed anything. "No," he said softly, "but courage does." Something in his voice made her look up. He was watching her with a tenderness she had no defense against. The room seemed to hold still around them. "Heath," she said, but his name came out barely above a whisper. He set the cup down and leaned forward a little. Then Martha called from the hallway asking if the patient was still breathing, and the moment broke like a thread pulled too soon. But it did not disappear. It stayed. After that night, the space between them changed. They laughed more easily, rode together more often. Sometimes Heath would ask her to come along when he checked the western fence or rode down to the lower meadow, and she always said yes even when she knew Martha already had the work well in hand. They talked about books, weather, horses, the future of the ranch, then about smaller, truer things. His mother's voice when she used to sing while sewing. Her father's study in Boston with shelves full of worn leather books. The first horse he ever broke. The first snow she ever saw. One evening they stopped by a little lake on the far side of the property, where the water caught the sunset in orange and gold. Heath stepped down from his horse and held out a hand to help her dismount. Neither of them let go right away. Lydia felt her breath hitch. Heath seemed to feel it too. But before either of them spoke, a wagon appeared 2 days later and brought trouble with it. The woman who stepped down wore a traveling dress of deep blue and gloves too fine for ranch dust. She was beautiful in the polished Eastern way Lydia had once imagined all truly admired women must be. Her blonde hair was pinned neatly. Her posture was perfect. Her eyes were cool. "I'm here to see Heath Vance," she said. Lydia stood on the porch with one hand still on the doorframe. "And you are?" "Julia Harrington." The name meant nothing to Lydia. It meant something to Martha Wilson, who had just come up behind her carrying a basket of washing. Martha stopped short and muttered under her breath, "Well, I'll be." That was enough to make Lydia's stomach tighten. She led Julia into the sitting room and sent one of the hands to fetch Heath from the south pasture. The wait felt longer than it was. Julia sat as if the room already belonged to her, looking around with faint amusement, as though she were taking measure of everything Heath had built and deciding how it compared to whatever world she came from. When Heath finally entered and saw her, he stopped dead. "Julia." Julia rose with a smile that would have seemed gentle if Lydia had not already seen the calculation in it. "Hello, Heath." Lydia stepped back, ready to leave them privacy. Heath's voice stopped her. "Stay." She turned. He had moved to stand beside her, not Julia. That was the first thing. The second was the way Julia's smile faltered when she saw it. "I came because I heard you. Done well for yourself," Julia said, smoothing her gloves. "I was passing through Billings and thought perhaps we ought to speak." "There's nothing to speak about," Heath said. Julia's eyes flicked to Lydia. "In front of hired help." The temperature in the room dropped at once. Lydia felt the insult like a slap, but before she could answer, Heath did. "Anything you have to say can be said in front of Miss Owen." Julia went very still. Then, with a softness that looked practiced, she said, "Heath, that's hardly fair. We once meant a great deal to one another." Lydia understood then. This was not just some woman from his past. This was the woman, the one who had mattered, the one who had hurt him. Julia took a small step closer. "I made mistakes. I was young. My father pushed me into choices I should have fought harder against." Heath's face showed nothing. "I'm sorry for that," she went on, "but perhaps enough time has passed for both of us to reconsider." Lydia kept herself very still, though inside something was unraveling. Then Heath answered in a voice so steady it almost hurt to hear. "That chapter is closed." Julia blinked, closed. Yes. She searched his face. Because of her. Heath did not hesitate. My heart is engaged elsewhere now. The silence that followed felt sharp enough to cut skin. Julia's face changed first to disbelief, then pride, then something like humiliation. She gathered herself quickly, but not quickly enough to hide the blow. I see, she said. She turned to Lydia with a look too composed to be kind. Then I wish you joy of it. And with that she left. The front door shut behind her. The whole house seemed to exhale. Lydia looked at Heath. Did you love her very much? The question came out softer than she intended. He took a long breath before answering. I thought I did. That hurt more than she expected. Then he stepped closer. But what I feel for you is not like that, he said. What I feel for you is steadier, deeper, real in a way I didn't know I was capable of. Her eyes stung at once. Heath. He lifted one hand slowly, giving her time to refuse, and touched her cheek. I love you, Lydia. The room blurred. No one had ever said those words to her with reverence before. Thomas had said them with charm and convenience. This was something else entirely. This felt like being seen. I love you too, she whispered. He kissed her then, not like a man claiming something, like a man making a promise. The kiss was gentle, warm, patient. It left her trembling when he drew back, but not from fear. The happiness of that moment lasted 6 days. Then a telegram arrived. Charlie brought it in at supper with a grim face, and Heath took one look at Lydia before opening it, as if he already knew it had something to do with her. His expression hardened as he read. What is it? Lydia asked. He handed her the paper. Thomas Owens had been arrested in Denver for fraud and held pending trial. Since Lydia was still legally his wife, authorities required her presence if she wished to pursue dissolution of marriage and avoid future claim. Her hand shook as she lowered the telegram. Thomas was alive, not gone to California, not dead in some ditch. Alive, waiting behind bars. I'll go with you, Heath said at once. She looked up. You don't have to. Yes, he said, I do. The journey to Denver was harder than the one to North Star had been. Then she had been leaving shame behind. Now she was riding toward the man who had caused it. But Heath never let fear grow too large. He stayed beside her mile after mile, never crowding, never pushing, only present in the steady way she had come to trust most. The jail in Denver was gray, cold, and smelled of damp stone. When Thomas was brought into the meeting room, Lydia nearly did not recognize him. He had lost weight. His hair was unkempt. The easy charm she remembered had rotted into bitterness. But the eyes were the same, clever, self-serving, always looking for advantage. He saw Heath first, then Lydia. A laugh crawled out of him, ugly and thin. So, he said, dropping into the chair across from them, you found yourself a new rescuer. Lydia did not flinch. You sold me, she said. Thomas leaned back. I was desperate. You were cruel. He opened his mouth, perhaps to charm, perhaps to blame, perhaps to lie again. Heath's lawyer placed the papers on the table before he could. $500, the lawyer said, in exchange for your signature, full dissolution, no future claims. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he read. 500, he repeated. Seems I sold too low. Heath's voice turned to steel. Take it or don't, but it's the only offer you'll see from me. Thomas looked from Heath to Lydia, and something in his face shifted. Not shame. He was not built for shame, but perhaps recognition. He saw what stood beside her now: respect, protection, love. He had never given her any of those things. At last he reached for the pen. I suppose that's more than I ever offered you, he muttered. He signed. When they stepped out into the sunlight after, Lydia stood still on the courthouse steps and let the air fill her lungs. For the first time since Thomas entered her life, she felt completely free. No chains hidden in marriage vows, no debt tied to her name, no hand over her future. Heath turned to her. There was something almost fierce in his face now, as if he had been holding back a storm of his own. I was going to wait, he said. She blinked. Wait for what? He took one step closer. Then right there on the Denver street with wagons rolling past and strangers hurrying by, Heath Vance went down on one knee. Lydia's heart stopped. "I don't want to wait another day to say what I mean," he said, looking up at her with those clear blue eyes that had changed everything in Sheridan. "Lydia Owen, will you marry me? Not because you need saving, not because you have nowhere else to go, because I love you, because I want to build every year I have left with you." Her eyes filled so quickly she could hardly see him. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder through tears and laughter together. "Yes, Heath Vance, I will." Their wedding took place in autumn at North Star, under gold leaves with the mountain standing watch in the distance. Charlie Wilson cried and denied it. Martha Wilson cried and admitted it proudly. Martha Coleman, who had come to stay for a season and then another, stood beside Lydia smiling so hard it seemed to light her whole face. Heath looked at Lydia as if there were no one else in the world. And when he spoke his vows, his voice shook on the promise to honor her freedom as fiercely as he honored her heart. Years later, people still told the story of the cowboy who paid $500 to stop a wrong and ended up finding the woman meant to share his life. But the truth was always simpler to Lydia. He had not just bought her freedom. He had restored her dignity when the world tried to strip it away. He had given her work, safety, patience, and the one thing she had nearly stopped believing in: a future. One evening long after their children were born, Lydia sat with Heath beside the little lake where they had first begun to understand what was growing between them. The water held the sunset in gold and rose. The wind moved softly through the grass. She leaned against his shoulder and said the words that had waited years to be spoken. "You bought my freedom," she whispered, "but you gave me a life worth living." Heath kissed her forehead. "No," he said softly, "you saved mine." And under the Montana sky, with the North Star rising above the valley that had become their home, Lydia knew the truest thing of all. The worst day of her life had led her to the man who would spend every day after proving she was never something to be sold. She was someone to be loved.